We're here at McGill University for the CETA conference with Professor David Gantz of the University of Arizona. He's an expert in international trade and business law. Professor Gantz, thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
You discussed in your presentation that the CETA could be either a floor or a ceiling with respect to the U.S. and its TTIP negotiations. What is your view on what it will turn out to be?
I think it depends on the provisions, but I think in some cases, probably the U.S. will say to the EU, well, you are willing to agree to this with Canada, and we can't accept anything less. I think there may be other areas where either the U.S. Or the EU say, well, look, you, the EU, or you, the U.S., are asking us to go much further than, for example, the EU was willing to go with Canada in certain areas like agricultural products, and we're not going to go any further.
In your presentation, you discussed some areas of possible concern for the Americans in negotiating the TTIP in geographical indications, government procurement, IP, investment. Given what Canada's and the EU have agreed to in the CETA, which of these are of most concern for the U.S. in the negotiations?
Of course, I have the disadvantage of not knowing where the negotiations stand, since in most respects they are secret. But I think there are some areas, for example, the geographical indications are more sensitive for the U.S. than they are for Canada, because we probably have more problems in terms of particularly in the area of cheese and meats, than the Canadians do, and in which case it may be harder for us to negotiate provisions which are acceptable to our food products producers than was the case with Canada.
How will the CETA and any eventual TTIP interact with the NAFTA?
Well, the provisions, we don't know what TTIP will have or if it will exist. The provisions of CETA in some areas would, if that were the only agreement, give the EU a significant advantage. The most obvious one is in the government procurement area, whereas under CETA, the EU will have access to provincial and municipal government procurement, whereas under NAFTA, the government procurement only applies to the federal governments of the three countries. So that would be a tremendous disadvantage for U.S. Services and goods producers that want to sell to governments.
Are there any other areas that the NAFTA would affect regulatory cooperation or environment, labor?
I think environment and labor, it's really hard to say. I suspect that the TTIP provisions will probably be more like those with the CETA than they are with some of the more recent free trade agreements. Certainly in the agricultural market access issues, there have been continuing issues between the U.S. and Canada, where the competitive situations may well be changed by CETA in favor of the EU compared to U.S. producers.
What is the current situation in the U.S.? Is there political will to conclude this deal with the European Union?
I think it's really quite uncertain at the moment. The Obama administration has been very clear that it wishes to have this agreement go forward. Whether or not the administration can bring along some of the more recalcitrant Democrats in Congress and the Senate to support the agreement, I think is still an open question. I think pretty much whatever happens with the Senate, and it probably will have a Republican majority after the middle of next week, or at least the beginning of January, the House is always much more of an issue when it comes to getting trade legislation, and a Republican majority in the House still needs a number of Democratic votes in order to pass trade legislation, because there are a certain number of Republicans who would oppose it. And whether or not it will be possible for there to be sufficient Democratic support in the House for TPP or TTIP when the time comes, I think is still a very open question. As you know, we've had a very, very acrimonious relationship between Republicans in the Congress and the Democratic president, And whether that can be bridged in an area where typically there is common interest in getting trade agreements completed, I think is still an open question. And we won't know this probably until March or April at the earliest.
Professor Gantz, I just want to thank you very much for your time today and enjoy your time in Montreal.
It's a pleasure, and it's always nice to be in Montreal.